Hello, everyone. You're listening to Speaking of Art School, an oral history project created to perpetuate the legacy and culture of the San Francisco Art Institute. I'm your host, Thomas Houston. Thanks for listening.
My name is Thomas Houston, and I am the creator and the host of this series, Speaking of Art School. I'm a proud graduate of San Francisco Art Institute, class of 1984. And today I have the pleasure of speaking with Jeremy Morgan, who was not only a student, but has become faculty for many years. And I'm very appreciative of your participating in this project, Jeremy. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm excited to join you.
Yeah, awesome. That's great. So just to begin, maybe you could tell a little bit about where you came from and how you landed at the Art Institute.
Sure. Well, actually, I came as a grad. What happened was I had my education in England. I went to the Ruskin School of Drawing at Oxford University, then worked there for a year as a department manager, and then got a place at the Royal Academy Schools in London, where I went for my postgraduate. And then after that, when I graduated, I knew that I needed to do more by way of research into art in terms of what my particular interests were and where I wanted to take myself as an artist and as a teacher. So I got the opportunity. I applied for a fellowship called the then Harkness Fellowship. It's now called the Atlantic Fellowship. But in those days, it was a fellowship that was rather like the Fulbright, but it's a smaller organization. And much to my delight, was much more wealthy than the Fulbright. So I got a lot of money for 2 years to come to America. In applying for the fellowship, it was one of three areas I was interested: the United States, Japan / China, one of those two, or Europe. Those are the centers of artistic traditions that I wanted to explore. And the one that worked out for me was America. So having got the fellowship, I had applied for various schools in the country and been accepted provisionally, depending upon funding. But when I was given the place, the fellowship committee had a placement officer who contacted me and said, we think that you would benefit from going to the San Francisco Art Institute. This is in 1983. And I said, I'd never heard of it. But, what was it about it that made you think that would be a good place? They said, well, you've got a chance to go to Yale or Stanford, and they're excellent schools. But you've done in England something similar like the Royal Academy in Oxford. You've had a very, very nice, solid education. But we think you should take this opportunity to have a broader education in the arts. And one of your reasons for going to America was obviously to do with abstract expressionism historically, and then an understanding of the now contemporary moment of American painting. But also you have innate interest in Asia, and that would take you to the edge of the Western world. So once they put that together for me, it made perfect sense. So I ended up coming to the Art Institute, which I did in the fall of 1983. And that's when I started my whole connection with the Bay Area and San Francisco Art Institute in particular.
Awesome, right. That's great. And did it seem like a good fit right out of the gate for you?
Yes, yeah, it's a good question because though the language is similar enough for it not to be difficult, there are cultural differences between America and Britain, and because of films and the fact that my father, as a lecturer in geography, had gone to Canada with the family. I went with him with my mum and brother when I was 9, so I had a little experience of North America, this being Canada rather than America, but it wasn't unfamiliar to me. And obviously through movies, and I had many American friends at colleges, both undergrad and grad. So I had a familiarity enough with American culture, and most particularly its history. Landscape painting into abstraction was my main area of interest. So when I got here, I felt, the old adage, go west, young man, young woman, young person, that made sense to me. And it was really when I stood at Ocean Beach. I used to have an apartment downtown, which I lived in for many, many years. And for the first couple of years, I deliberately didn't get a vehicle because San Francisco was small enough I could walk most places. And I wanted to know the city. And driving, while convenient, doesn't give you access, ironically, to the intimacies of a city. So walking through its streets and its districts, I became pretty familiar. And I went to all the neighborhoods that I could within reason go to, and sense their difference. So when I stood at the edge of the Pacific Ocean, stared out from Ocean Beach, I thought, this is it. I'm at the edge of the Western world. Everything I've known culturally, including this new space, which there is some connection to through language and the history of the country, all of a sudden was facing out into the newness of another world I didn't know. So it was exciting, because I think I soon became aware that people who come to California historically either come obviously primarily from Asia, they come from the north and the south too, but historically with a great reference to the native community, which is a whole other story. But those incomers came across the country. When you fly across the country, which I do quite often now, I often spend time looking out the window because I like doing that, but also seeing the vast tracts of untrammeled land, realizing what journeys people made to eventually inhabit this. Of course, the Mexicans were here, the indigenous people here, but for the incomers, it was a massive labor, act of belief, faith, or what have you.
Right.
So I felt, though I came under much more comfortable circumstances, that in my own way, I was in a kind of pioneering space, which was a new space to me, where the landscape was grand, ancient, vast, and varied. And landscape is one of my abiding interests as an artist. My environment is crucially important to me, in particular, because I sense a lot of the energy from the landscape and the climate. So this was, being on the edge of an oceanic and on an earthquake fault and everything else, it was a very, very invigorating space, let's put it that way. And
Right.
and culturally, I was open, because there seemed to be an internationalism here. San Francisco is strange. It's not really international, nor is it cosmopolitan, but it is multicultural in many interesting ways. And there's an meeting of East and West becomes very tangible here,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And so your work coming into SFAI was already grounded in the landscape and abstraction.
Yes,
And,
I have over the years learned to, part of my own training and development as an artist is I had a formal training, as most artists, most cultures, certainly in Western cultures, have within the sort of Bauhaus back to the Renaissance of drawing for the figure, portraiture, landscape, still life, and the motifs of painting. I had all of that education. Plus, I had fairly good grounding in Eastern sensibilities through studying with the keeper of Eastern art at the Ashmolean Oxford Museum. And so I had a great deal of interest in Asiatic art, but it was something about the landscape and the themes of landscape that early on in my art, I was interested in environments, the weather, the energy of the universe, if you will, and the topographies and morphology of the earth. My father was a geographer, which gave me added insight into the landscapes. When we walk in the landscapes, I'd ask him about why there was a hill there or a waterfall there. I didn't take these things for granted. They were all quite magical, but he explained to me really about earth formation, geology, ice ages. In the case of the UK, we were privy to a lot of the ice age formations. So I began to see the landscape not only as that I find nature both appealing and beautiful and mysterious, but it was comforting in a way, but also full of mystery. And I understood that it was, one has a tendency to romanticize, and that's not necessarily bad, but they also, for me, it's important to realize that nature, in a sense, doesn't care about us one way or the other. It's not our enemy, nor is it our friend. It simply is. It's the abode within which we exist and to which we should pay a lot more attention, which we're now finding out to our cost we haven't done enough of. But,
right.
I see it as we live in a living universe. We're part of that living universe, but our arrogance and intelligence has removed us from what should be a more holistic relationship to that part of the world that I think indigenous cultures still have with their relationship to nature. But modernization, such as it is, or the development of industry and technology, has developed capabilities we have for which I don't think we're still fully suited to fully understand. And part of that is the abuse of nature, if you will, for the sake of taking its resources without considering about balancing or harmony, all of those good things that should be thought about.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, looking at at some of your pieces, speaking of flying across the country,
yeah,
they do hearken to me anyway, about looking out of a of an airplane over the landscape. There's something about that that is very interesting. I can see those forms,
Yeah.
you know, those abstractions and delineations of space.
Yeah. Yeah.
And,
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there's two things I can tell you that, simple, quick stories. But one is in my own studies as as an art historian as well as studio painter at Oxford. I had to take degrees in art history, though my certificate in fine art is primarily painting, and there is a history component. And I loved art history as a way of understanding where it all came from. But in my research, especially when I became more and more interested in abstraction, I looked at the various, in the modern Western tradition, as well as the ancient traditions of the world. And in the modern Western, obviously, there's Hilma af Klint and Kandinsky, who are two stellar sort of pioneers of abstraction amongst many. But in Kandinsky writings, he talks about going up in an aircraft for the first time. And when the plane tilted at an angle, what he'd always assumed was the horizon, given his relative position of standing on Earth, was suddenly completely gone. And suddenly the Earth was a surface.
yes.
He looked at space through the surface, but there was no, he was in the sky he used to look at. I thought, wow, that's fantastic.
Right.
And then many years later, I had the opportunity, when I was chair back in the mid to late 90s, a very wonderful woman, Louise Herrick, was one of my students, and her husband, Al, they both semi-retired and worked tirelessly for other people all their lives, were now enjoying a semi-retirement, which for Louise meant she was coming to study painting, which she'd always had a love for. And now she could devote herself to it full time. She was a very good painter, still is. And so she very kindly invited me up for a weekend with her and her husband. They lived out in the Sierras, or the foothills of the Sierras, when they weren't in San Francisco. And she thought I'd been working too hard and they wanted to treat me. So I was very nice. I took it as a little mini vacation. I'd also shared with her my love for flying. I'm not a pilot and never tried to be one, but I always try to get the window seat when I fly. I never take it for granted. Every time I fly, it's as if for the first time, even though I'm relatively seasoned. And I cannot stand or abide people who sleep while they sit next to a window. It seems criminal to me. How often are you 35,000 feet in the air looking down on the Earth or up into space? How blasé can you be? So anyway, that said, she had arranged for me. We had a very nice meal and nice day in the countryside. And then the next morning, there was a knock on the door. She said, "Could you answer that, please?" And there was a guy standing there. I was then in my 40s. I'm now the age he was, probably mid-60s. So he was very trim and dapper in a full military get-up flying suit, introduced himself. And so we all got into a car with this fellow, Lois and her husband, Al, and this guy, I can't remember his name, I'm afraid, but we drove us to a hangar in a small airfield, not far from where they lived. He opened up the hangar and there was a biplane. And he said, "You know what this is?" And I said, "Well, it's a biplane and I hope it's an aerobatic plane." He says, "It is. And I'm taking you up in it." I said, "What?" So anyway, I was already now beyond excited. And he gave me the suit, which I put on. And then he said, "Give me something on the back," which is basically my parachute. And he said, "This is your safety lesson." I said, "Okay, what is that?" I said, "If I have to eject, you're going to be in the front seat. You'll be ejected at about 120 miles an hour. And once you're out of the aircraft, just pull anything red that you see in your near vicinity." There were 5 red tags in my front and on my side. I said, "That's it?" He said, "Yeah. Then hopefully a parachute will come out. If we're going to crash, you'll land safely." I said, "Okay, good." So anyway, off we went in this plane, and it was an hour and a half of pure ecstasy, flying upside down, barrel rolls. But again, thinking of Mr. Kandinsky, as I turned, we did loop the loops and flew upside down. I could see the ocean about 100 miles one direction, and to the other side, I could see the Sierras, and then above me, the sky, and straight below me, the Earth. And it was like what I call optical aerobatic cubism. It was no longer an idea, it was a reality, multi-viewpoints. And that, in all seriousness, I wanted to capture the dynamics of that. And so I appreciate you pointing out that you recognize the kind of aerialism in my work, because there's a British painter, Peter Lanyon, who many people don't know, but I think you, Thomas, would like him. He's an abstractionist from the 50s. He was a friend of Rothko. The American abstract expressionists and many British painters had a dialogue across the Atlantic. The Cornish painters from London would go to Cornwall, which was like England's version of the Hamptons is to New York, a place where they went to study in nature. And they would come to each other's country and share ideas. And Peter Lanyon was a glider pilot. an avid glider. It's actually sadly what killed him, but he died doing what he loved.
Right.
But he said he wanted to make paintings if he could from the glider, which was not practical. So he took the flights and then remembered as much as he could, would come back to the studio and paint the sensation of riding the air over the landscape.
Wow.
And then finally, when I saw the works of the German painter, Caspar Friedrich, I was contemplating them one day, my first time of seeing more than a couple in a small exhibition in London. And I was mesmerized by the painting, but I realized why I liked them was he was giving me views, very particular views of different types of landscape, but as if I was suspended in the air. He didn't do a foreground in a regular sense that most Western painters do. You could only go into his paintings with your mind, not your body.
Right.
And that was, to me, a liberating moment. And the last thing was when an instructor at the Ruskin said, when I was working on some martial arts paintings and paintings based on human movement and doing more traditional landscapes and trying to put them together in my head. And he said, perhaps you could think about making paintings not of the world you see in motion, but as if you are moving and painting that experience. So that took me to the realm of the pilot or the bird, where I'm flying through space over the land, through its processes. And that's where it all comes from, basically.
That's great. That is awesome. I definitely get the sense of transcendentalism in your work. That's how I would describe it anyway.
Good. Well, I appreciate that. You and I know, and most of the viewers will know that, you know, in the art world, amongst most of the contemporary art world, use of the term spiritual or transcendental has dangerous consequences in an over-intellectualized world.
Right.
It shouldn't be in opposition to the spiritual, but often is. And I am not a practitioner of anything, but as I've spoken to you about before in the past, I have an ongoing interest through my world of training in the martial arts, which took me to the philosophies behind the martial arts, which took me back through Zen Buddhism and Buddhism back to Taoism. And Taoism is a form of cosmological thinking and philosophy that makes great sense to me. And when I was reading a book in China early on in visits I started making there back in the 90s, I now go there regularly. I was reading, trying to understand both the beauty of what I was looking at, but how it was different from what I understood from a Western canon. And the writer, who was Chinese, made a beautiful observation that quite simply that liberated me from being overly concerned about it. I can now understand what the compulsion was for that work. She said, when a Western person, trained or otherwise, looks at Chinese art, but somebody used to Western art, they will often perhaps feel a certain disconnection because they see work which is generally non-chromatic, very thin in the sense that it's watercolor-like rather than oil-based or even now acrylic, and insubstantial apparently to most Western minds. But she said, I would only ask the dear reader to consider that when a Sung Dynasty painter or a painter of other dynasties painting the landscape in particular is working, they are not working from an emotional only or intellectual only point of view. There are concepts and feelings involved, but what they're really doing is painting their resonance with the Tao. And as soon as I read that, I thought, that's it. Not prayer, not quite contemplation, somewhere in between both, where the working of a painting is a form of archiving a state of mind, which has to do with the optical world and the concomitant feelings of immateriality that suffuse the world we see as phenomenal.
Right.
And so for me, that was what basically painting allowed me to do. Wordlessly encapsulate, archive, and in a sense, create a kind of chromatic fossil or monochromatic fossil of an experience.
Exactly. Right. Right. That's awesome. I personally can so relate to that. I definitely feel like my work is, you know, a painting is a thing that's basically a residue left behind of an experience.
Exactly.
And that's
exactly
what it
right.
is. Yeah. So that's what
I call it the psychic archive is what I term it.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Tell me, what were some of your experiences at the Art Institute in terms of your work? Anything that was challenging or eye-opening or those kinds of things?
Well, it's a good question, and I probably could spend way too long giving you an answer. So I know we've got limited time. I don't want to rabbit on too long, but there are a few things. I had one of my instructors was Julius Satosky, which I think you will remember him. He was there,
Oh yeah,
a major part of the painting department for many, many years.
Mhm.
Not only a truly great artist, and this is the thing often people say about people they care about, and I cared for him deeply, but my good friend Dave Tangley, who hopefully you might get to meet on one of these occasions when
Right.
maybe you do an interview with him, was very
Yeah.
close to Julius. I was close to Julius, but David became very close to him. But we both recognized in him not only a kind of sage-like teaching style. He wasn't Mr. Verbose. He's extremely intelligent and articulate, but he was almost Zen-like in his teaching. I said, being taught by Julius was rather like a leaf collecting, creating chlorophyll from the sun. It was like a
Right.
process of osmosis rather than, this is what I'm saying, what do you hear? He just imbued you with a sense of possibility.
Right.
And he had a very good eye and very intelligent, thoughtful person, to say the least. But when I first came here, one of the reasons I came here was that I wanted to understand what happened to painters, both European, British, and those born here during that time we call abstract expressionism. Something happened where with the beginning of World War II and then the end of World War II, that time frame is incredibly critical for many parts of the world for obvious reasons, but culturally, both in Europe and America, had massive consequences. Julius had been in World War II, some of the great battles, survived it,
Mhm.
came out and went to eventually to, I think, there's a school in New York, I'm gonna forget its name now, but it was like a free school, but a very good school.
Right.
He went there after going to an academy in Paris before he got back to America.
Right.
And he had what I call a European sensibility inside an American consciousness.
Mhm.
And, whatever the consciousness of a given culture, we're now dealing with such levels of complexity and interraciality that it's very difficult to simply define an American as opposed to a British or a French. But, historically, at the risk of generalizations, there was something in America, something about America, which is why I came here, which was truly liberating. And it was not that one was confined necessarily in Europe, but what you had in Europe was a tradition. Now, when I was at the Academy, I saw my first serious exhibition of Abex painting, all of the greats, including the ones that had been not written before, Grace Hartigan and, Lee Krasner, and some of the women that had been left out of many shows. This was a more comprehensive show, which gave me not only a fuller range of the kind of work that was going on, men and women were doing, but also the kind of vision they had. And I was with a British painter who was my mentor, William Scott, who was a friend of Rothko and Klein and Peter Lanyon, the guy I mentioned earlier. He took me under his wing and I worked with him, stretching his paintings for him. He basically mentored me through my last year at the Academy. And he took me to this exhibition and he said, what do you notice about this work? We've been here for 4 hours. What's your abiding impression? And I was a bit, dumbstruck because I thought, well, I've got to say something really smart, but I don't know what it is I can say because I'm overwhelmed at the moment. And he turned to me and he said, I'm going to offer you an answer. I said, please do. He said, I'll share with you what I realized when I met my first Americans through their work. That what you're witness to is a kind of level of rawness and of violence in a constructive sense, of an energy unabridged by self-consciousness. He said, in Europe, we're still tied to the notion of a post-cubistic grid. This is back in, the 50s and 60s you're talking. I still felt it in Britain in the 80s. We had seen great American art and art from other cultures, but he was still bound to the traditions which we were both proud of, but also inhibited by. Like I say to all my students, and what was said to me a long time ago, your own sensibility is your defining and your most confining property. You have to know how to manage it. Otherwise, you work only within the confines of your own ability and you lose the capacity to surprise yourself. Right. So my golden rule has been to do that. So America taught me, American paintings done in America, that what can be audacious or bold or anarchistic or in some sense brash is actually to do with a kind of liberation of constraint, from constraint. And there's good and bad aspects to that, but at its very best, I find it very liberating. It was one of the compulsions that brought me here. Was a kind of freedom. And when I got to the landscape, I thought, this is beyond the politics of indigenous and all those other things which can't be forgotten, but right now, for the sake of discussion, the art I was coming to see was born out of that sense of liberation. Those artists came in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. The landscape artists forming the American sublime romantic tradition was an extension of the European one. They even here went off to Mexico or to the Arctic to find even more dramatic landscapes. Because for them, having come from Europe historically, which was overly farmed with the exception of the mountainous areas, most of Europe was farmed very well and manicured. Here, because the native culture didn't farm to exhaustion, the landscape still held most of its normal looks. There hadn't been giant clearances of forest like they were in Europe to make pasture land. You had natural grazing lands here. So obviously the landscape had been fashioned to some degree, but to much less marked degrees. So there was a kind of paradise realized here.
Yeah.
And by the time the abstract expressionists came along, it was the very opposite, because it was now an urban society that art was born from. But what gave it birth was, I think, two things: the nuclear bomb and the economic depression were arguably two of the most important protagonistic elements that created the ABEX movement. And these people were not just trying to be different for the sake of it. They genuinely found a desire to go back to something ancient or primeval almost within them, like feelings, pure feelings, which the Russians had done in their term for abstraction, move away from the optical mimesis process of painting and look into an inner reality. And that's what many, that doesn't preclude painting realistically. Many fantastic landscape painters are deeply inward looking, like Turner and Friedrich are great examples of optically referential artists who also imbue it with a huge mystical quality, you know.
Yeah.
And those were the things that really compelled me. So coming here, a particular story, slightly different, but gives you a sense of the artists in particular. After I finished my studies, I took on a job as department manager when I met you for the first year. After my graduation, I was working as department manager. And when I did so, I had, you know, many boring jobs as well as the fun ones of helping people make paintings and talking to them about them. But on one occasion, a student came to me and said there was a very unpleasant bag, the smell coming from a bag on the balcony, one of the painting studios. So I went in to check it out. And sure enough, there was a Safeway bag with clearly some kind of rotting something in it. And I picked it up with a glove, took it to the compactor right by the rack room back there in Studio 113, dropped it in triumphantly and pressed the compactor to pack it away, go back and have my lunch. In the afternoon, a student rushes in, one of my painting students says, Jeremy, what did you do with my bag? And I said, what, you mean the Safeway bag? I said, yes, I've got rotting chicken in there for a performance. I said, what? I said, well, I threw it away. She said, no, I've been keeping that for 3 days. So I went back into the compactor, unpacked it, got into the compactor, found her bag, now dripping green slime, gave it to her. She ran off to a class, I think with Tony LeBlanc, and he was doing a performance class with them. And she came back later and said, it was fantastic. Everybody was really ill. It was so successful. And I said, okay, this place is a little unusual.
Yes. Oh, that's fantastic. So you probably helped her out by putting it in the compactor. For
I helped with the performance. I hope so. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's great. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. You never know. You just never know. But,
well, I think, I mean, the thing is with the Art Institute that I've always said, it draws a certain kind of person, and then there's not one kind of person, obviously, but there's a range. And there, those, I mean, an example was when I was teaching, after I finished department manager, I made me chair, and I taught for a couple of years before becoming regular faculty. And in one of my first classes, I had a very cantankerous chap. He was probably in his 60s, and he was kind of snappy. You know, I mean, most people there are pretty chilled and relaxing. He was never nasty, but I said to him, I said, well, why are you here? I just want to know why, because he was not a regular student age. He was much older.
Sure.
And I was interested. I wanted to help him. He said, I've been working for the LA Times as city editor for the last 50 years when all I wanted to do is paint. Now I've come here and you're going to teach me how to paint. I said, well, I'm going to be your guide, but you have to learn how to paint. I don't learn for you. All I can do is direct you.
Right.
He looked at me and he said, I said, if you want to learn how to paint, there's other places you can go.
Yep.
They will tell you how to mix colors. I can tell you that stuff, but I'm more interested in why you want to paint and what the heck is you're going to paint once you learn. Not teaching you how to paint apples and oranges.
Yeah.
That's not really what I do. Anyway,
Right.
he wanted to paint still lifes, so I created a class for him within my class, and he came back within a year, and he said, "This has been liberation for me. Thank you." And I said, "It's been liberation for me too."
Awesome.
But it was good because you find those people have a particular need. And I like with the Art Institute that the faculty was given a certain leeway. There are class titles and themes and topics. And as you know, everybody there teaches in a different way than anybody else.
Yep.
But what's generally accepted is a latitude and flexibility about what the expectations are. And I think the school is beautiful for that. And I always say, in terms of the interdisciplinary aspect, which has been a big thing about the Art Institute's character, and a big issue for many art schools now about, being interdisciplinary. And I believe in interdisciplinary. I don't believe in no disciplinary.
Right.
So as I say, you go from a class I'm teaching to one where my colleague Tim Berry is teaching printmaking, or Tony's doing a class in performance, or Linda Connor is doing one in photography. You as a student have islands of possibility in a sea, islands of hope in a sea of possibility. So you go from one department to the other, getting the information you need and making fusions where you want to between painting and sculpture, painting and film, pure painting, pure printmaking. That's the beauty of the place. It makes it very unlike most other schools I know.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that is, I totally agree. I speaking of liberation, I think back, I think it took me a good part of that first semester to let go of the reins, throw the oars out of the boat, After that, it was good, but it was a little bit rocky at first, but
Well, the thing is, each of us has our own ways of navigating things. And I think the Art Institute, that's a good way you're putting it, because it's basically taking off the training wheels. The training wheels are there for a reason, but there comes a point where you have to make the leap. And the Art Institute will generally encourage that. Now, it doesn't always get it right. Some people leave because it's not the right place. And that's good. I always take admissions very seriously because I like to be involved in the admissions process, because, as I say to the admissions people, I'm hopefully both a magnet and also a sieve for those who they think they want to come to our school, but they actually want something different. So I'll send them to try, a state school or another private school somewhere which specializes more in design. You can be make sure you're helping. I say to the students, I only want you here if you want to be here. Otherwise there's no point. I'm not going to draw you in here because we just want bums in seats. That's not what it's about. We need the right kind of person. And that doesn't mean one type. It just means somebody who will fit into a very pluralistic environment and feel at home here, And it's not for everybody. It's quite very seriously true. And for a while, remember, right about the time you and I met, up to that point, the Art Institute didn't accept people who hadn't got at least 2 years community college. They also had a lot of GI Bill people coming back out of Vietnam. So it was a school for people who had, the cliche of the University of Life school that had been out in the real world and now wanted to come and do some art. So they had a different voice, different things to say. And there's nothing against people who were younger, but the demographics changed within the country. So the Art Institute, by the end of the late 90s, was a wider range of students and generally younger than the preceding probably 20 or 30 years,
Right, exactly, right, interesting, There was something I was thinking about. Oh, when you were a grad student, at what point did it start to manifest that you were going to become faculty during that process of being a student?
Well, to be fair, I owe that to my father and mother. My father was a political geography lecturer at Bristol University in the west of England and had been for all of my, he did his PhD when I was born, and he started teaching when I was 2 and eventually got a job at Bristol when I was 3, when we moved from Cambridge to Bristol. And so all my life, he'd been in university lecturer, writer, educational books, articles, scholar, and primarily teacher. And he used to invite, in the British system in universities, often tutorials are year related. So you don't have mixed years in a tutorial. So to encourage more socialization, he would have once or twice a year potluck for all of his tutees from the different 3 years. So they get to meet each other socially, get to know each other, maybe have some area interest or whatever. and started to create friendships that way. They come to our house, so I'd see this group of students coming, all of whom were very nice people and very excited to be there, having a nice social time, and I would help present food and stuff. And about the age of 9 or 10 till I was about 16 or 17, he did that. And so I was used to talking to people who were students for one reason or other, and their kind of enthusiasm about what they were doing. But also would talk to my dad after they left and sort of observing and asking questions. And I said to him, what is it about teaching that you like? Because obviously you're good with people. He said, I like communicating with people. But he said, I feel if you can't be doing what you want 100% of the time, which is probably not necessarily a good thing, but, you know, if you have to spend time doing other than the thing you love, you must make the thing you love have meaning. So teaching this topic he wants to do research on was, he said, also, I learn a lot from my students. And I never forgot that. I thought, because I always thought, you know, the teacher teaches. Well, the teacher teaches because the student wants to learn. But unlike school, which is perhaps more top down, at university and college, it becomes more lateral, because you might come to school with having been in the army or having been on an oil rig for 5 years. Your life experience is completely different from mine. So I have art experience where you don't have, but you have life experience that I don't have.
Right.
And so there's an exchange. My skill, hopefully, and desire is to help you find your voice artistically. But I have to listen to who you are, first of all. I have to understand your motives and your experience and try to read you, not so much as a psychologist, but read you as a person to think about, how can I help this person?
Yeah.
What is it they're seeking? And my job is to be a catalyst and an enabler without the negative side of that, because that can have negative connotations, but facilitator rather than enabler of your ambitions and dreams, and provide for you technical expertise in concert with, you know, a desire for you to reach a way for you to be eloquent and truthful about what you want to say and do as an artist, you know.
Yeah, right. Do you think that, well, I'm sure they have, I was going to ask how you feel the Art Institute students are different now or similar now to back when we were students there?
I think it's a very good question. I've actually answered this on alumni days. I think in essence, if you came back to the school now, because you're now a father and you've got the life experience you have, as I am, you're many years older than when we first knew each other, though you still got a lot of hair, you lucky bugger. I lost a lot of mine. Maybe teaching was more stressful than I realized. But you know, in reality, I think what it is that I'm losing my train of thought. What was it you actually asking me? I got waylaid. What was it?
Oh, the differences and similarities.
Oh, the students. No. So my point would be, if you came back to the Art Institute and sat in on a class, I don't think you'd feel out of place.
Right.
There obviously are things now about phones and the kind of art references people have.
Yeah.
And I think, but those probably would be true in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s.
Right.
It's just now, as the older you get, you tend to see things differently. I still hopefully have a mentality to try and think back. So I see people where they are and think about, okay, that's their frame of reference. And so I think the spirit of the student has really changed. There's something about that building and location, and culture probably expands rather than contracts, becomes maybe more complex and more complex, but not necessarily more complicated, maybe richer. So in that sense, the frames of reference are larger, but I don't think why people come there has probably changed very much. And maybe it represents, this is thing for all art schools and places of serious learning that are very specialist, particularly, is only certain types of people should become artists. And I think what's happened with the art world is there's so many now. And I think the complexity for artists is working about, what should I be doing? You know, I mean, I think the Art Institute gift to the world is its rarefied atmosphere. And I don't mean elitist, I just mean specialized, fine arts only. And I think there's a place for that, because that's like the area of research. Like universities are not only areas of deep intellectual knowledge seeking and exploration, but they're also to do with research. And the Art Institute faculty, like many schools now, we're not alone in this, but historically, we didn't have to be famous, but we had to be functioning as professional artists. Didn't have to have shows. That many of us have had museum shows, whether here and other places. We've had some famous faculty, but often very famous people don't have time to teach. So you got to be careful what you wish for.
Right.
And so I think the other thing is that the Art Institute instills in people a kind of vocational aspect rather than careerism. And it's like, you're in this for the long haul. There's no quick fixes. We live in a culture where, and the danger now for education institutions is because of the pressure of financial aspects, government loans to students. What are those students doing 5 years after they've left? Why did they get a fine arts education if they're working in Starbucks or they're working in Trader Joe's? Well, I say to them, education is not training. A serious society can educate on multiple levels. Training has its role. Being a mechanic is very honorable and very powerfully hard work for certain people and takes a lot of passion. But designing a car rather than mending it take another kind of knowledge and desire.
Right.
And so they're all important. It's not a hierarchy, but they do get ever more complex in terms of what they require. And I wish people, if you go to study French literature because you love French literature, you might be working in a bank 5 years later. Education isn't about training. It's about giving you the opportunity to make decisions based on knowledge of yourself.
Right.
And too often people get corralled in. They're going to be sports stars. They're going to be musicians. They're going to be doctors. And they don't want that necessarily. And so any education should be a serious kind of treading water before you take on a direction.
Yeah.
In the case of the Art Institute, we're generally, or specifically arts related, with a great deal now of very strong, powerful academic support in humanities, art history, theory and critics, etc. Very important information. But I think that's why I feel like I want to protect the Art Institute and institutions like it because they're becoming rarer.
Right.
So the kind of people that come there now, I think, are the kind of people that went there before, but maybe places like the Art Institute are rarer than they used to be.
Yeah. That's an interesting idea. It seems to me that the availability of so much information so instantly now would create a different student, with the internet. On the one hand, a lot smarter and just that access. Well, maybe not smarter, but just having access to so much information so quickly, it would have a different effect.
I think your point is a very good one, because I think there's many sides to this. And that's a very important point you made, and that is that the information base is in our hands. If we have an iPhone, a Samsung, or Android, or whatever we carry around with us, most of us are fortunate enough to have these things, which are, if had those things been available in world wars past, it would have been different scenarios altogether. There's so much power in the machines we have. But my friend Dave Tangley, who I mentioned already, talked a long time ago, and I said, you should write a book with that title. He said, the problem is recognition is replacing or becoming knowledge in people's minds. And I thought, exactly. That's a very important point. Now, to that point, the role of the artist, perhaps, they can or may not change the world. Their desire to may be an impetus for making their art. But what they hopefully have is a resonance within the world and the capacity to shift people's opinions based on the experience they provide, aesthetic or otherwise. But this idea that just because you have, like, people with iPhones are not photographers.
Sure.
They're what I call iPhone photographers, not the same thing.
Right.
I'm an iPhone photographer. I respect photographers because they understand a camera very different. What the iPhone does is astonishing. It's beyond belief for me, but I'm not a photographer. So I can create all sorts of things, but I know, looking at painting, how difficult it is to make a good painting.
Yeah, absolutely.
And and so each of these things demands a familiarity, but mostly it's to do with discernment. Back to your main point is, we live in this world now where we have, I think, a very important moment in art history in the West was the moment of pop art as opposed to abstract expressionism. Because what that really announced, possibly in a very succinct way, was a shift. Up to that point, art either came from experience, language, or in response to certain stimuli, writing, political events, etc.
Yeah.
But what happened was, there was reality, our optical field of experience, our mental capacity to understand it, and our desire to speak of it. But then what happened with the pop artists is they looked at, and this is where Warhol encapsulates this in good and bad ways. He brought painting, photography, print, fashion, and pop, and put them together.
Yeah.
And they're still trying to extricate from that. He put them together in very compelling ways. Postmodernism is the last fluorescence of his vision, about the 50 minutes of fame and all that other crap with, you know, these celebrity shows everywhere, the Kardashians and all this other nonsense. Who the hell cares about these people? But everybody's compelled to watch it, you know. They've turned us into unthinking, it's capitalist dream. We're now just at the trough, gobbling whatever they give us, you know. So our job as artists, I think, amongst many things, is to bring back to people, and I'm speaking now as a painter, but it references art, music of all kinds, but I'm speaking to you as a fellow painter. What our job is to bring back to people the capacity for them to see with volition and their own vision, and as it relates to something given to them by another with which they can feel a relationship.
Right.
And it's like the power of discernment, the power of seeing has been usurped by the advertising culture. Images of sex, power, and wealth are all too seductive. We know that. But just as people are wanting organic food rather than commercial crap, I think people culturally are seeking the real. I love all the new stuff. Don't get me wrong. I love techno music, all that other stuff. But you can't beat a guitar played properly by somebody who knows what they're doing, whether it's you know, a Bob Dylan-esque, I'm not a fan of, but he's very good at what he does. Or Segovia playing, you know, Spanish guitar. You can't beat the real thing. That they all still have a role. I don't believe in the kind of usurpation of one thing by another. It's an ever-opening possibility of realms. And that's what I like about it. Painting is still relevant. So is digital painting. So is digital photography. It's all relevant. Just find the tool and mediums that serve your purpose as an artist, you know.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
And I, you know, it's not a battle. This is the trouble, is we live in a culture where people say to me, how's your work? What are you doing now? As if, you know, what I'm doing now at 65 is what I started at 24. I'm just getting better at it. I'm not trying to improve on my ideas. I'm trying to get clearer about what I want to say.
Yeah, that was, I was gonna bring that up. I remember that from our previous conversation. And I personally really resonate with that, about the continuity of what you were doing, for example, when you were a young student and what you're doing now. And also I wanted to ask you a little bit about your most current work. I know you're working with ink and alcohol on Yupo paper, which is very interesting. So that's I wanted to get to that too, but just that idea about what you were doing then, what you're doing now, and just the whole continuity of that. And
it's a trajectory, Thomas. That's what I mean. You understand this, and I think most people will. I mean, it's not to say if you want to, you know, you want to do things and you've got to do them in different ways, that's fine. But for me, landscape, space, and time, the death of my brother in 91, which happened tragically early, he was 38, I was 35. He got struck down with esophageal cancer. He's my only sibling, and we were very, very close family. It was devastating, as you'll appreciate. But that loss had many consequences. And one of them, the positive things that came from it, was an affirmation of two things. A, the nature of love, because I love my brother dearly, and I miss him dearly to this day. But we had such a connection when he was alive that love is not a memory. It lives in me. It lives in his son, who's my nephew, who I adore. And, you know, in his wife, who gave birth to that son. You know, he's there in many forms. But there's something, this idea that in the art world, we've got this idea that things have to change. And I think it's important that you don't stay in the same place. But I believe it's like, you know, what part of a tree is more important in the sense as it's growing? Is it the first year, the second year, the 50th year? It's all important at the time it's growing. It all adds to what was, and what was there before makes what is. And so in that sense, I see it more that sort of analogy. I don't have to be a blooming flower each year. I rather like the tree rather than an annual, you know, or perennial. And there's the idea of duration, which is very important. So those early paintings I did when I looked at Turner and all those other artists I admired and started to emulate them, and then went through my process of looking at Chinese painting, with the privilege of going to China since I've been 1994 to now. I now teach in 2 places in China, now remotely, but normally I do site visits to Shanghai and Hangzhou. I've become more familiar with the subtleties of Chinese painting. And what I'm personally interested in is trying to fuse with the greatest of respect. I don't want to emulate something because it's already there, but a Chinese sensibility, such as I understand it, and a Western sensibility have a meeting point. And in my case, it's my love for both of those forms of art as a painter. So I'm trying to find ways. So I've been exploring using acrylic paint, covering the paintings with various forms of fake and actual silk, and painting through that to create what I call, when I see Chinese painting, what I'm overwhelmed by is the deafening silence, as one sinologist called it, the deafening silence of Sung Dynasty painting, the vastness of nature, as if your hands are over your ears and you hear the inner hum of your own body in the vastness of space. I love all of that. So there's that. And then there's the history of Western abstraction as we dissolve from the world of optical topography to the inner world of being, which you and I are interested in. So not to forego the beauty of what's out there, but to fuse it with what suffuses it, which is a life force and potentially the immaterial beauty that resides in the world, you know.
Right.
And so in terms of the alcoholing, that triggered for me. I went on a trip to see the Northern Lights in, I think it was about 2016. I went on a trip to Northern Canada, which was supposed to be the place in North America of many, excuse me, the place to see Northern Lights. I go there, and for the first time in Yellowknife history, there's no lights for a week. Unheard of. So I've gone there. I thought, well, this is a great adventure, but I've soon realized something very important. I started going out every night, 10 o'clock, the company would pick you up, take you to a viewing hut outside of the little township, underneath the magnificent open skies. And I waited 5 nights for something that never came. And the first thing, when I got back to wrote in my little iPad notes, nature is not an entertainment system. I've got to realize that. I thought I'd coming to be thrilled by nature. Well, I saw nature, but I didn't see the Northern Lights. I contemplated my art, what I was trying to do, and it made me think many things. Anyway, jump ahead 2 years, I go back to the same place. And this time I saw them. And when I saw them, for those of you that haven't seen it, I put it on your bucket list, because if you have any interest in seeing, which most artists tend to do, you will be thrilled beyond belief by the energy you perceive. Now, when I saw that movement, the first thing I thought about, apart from making kind of a photorealistic painting of the night sky with lovely lights in it, how could I create this property in a painting? I don't want to do mimesis.
Right.
And then 2 years later, I'm teaching a class in Jackson, Wyoming, which I've done for the last 20 years. Just during spring break at the Art Institute, I go and teach up there. It's up in the mountains. It's beautiful. I don't ski, but I love snow and mountains. So it's a fantastic environment with wonderful people up there. And I was working with one student. She started using this material, and I pride myself on knowing most art materials. And I thought, what the heck is this she's using? It was alcohol ink. Anyway, I bought some stuff, and I went back to my studio and I put it down on canvas, and it was like using nail varnish. It was just, I thought, why? It's really not very interesting at all. Why was I so mesmerized by it? And I thought, well, wait a minute. She was using Yupo, not a canvas. So that's the first mistake I made. So when I bought some Yupo, then I said to myself, every time I teach painting, the first thing I say to the students is, what is the type of paint you want to use, and what are its mediums? What do you dissolve the paint with? What are the mediums? How do you extend the paint? And you start with that knowledge, because that is the key. Where cadmium red in watercolor, oil, or acrylic is very different, but it's still cadmium red. But in oil, it's different from acrylic, and it's different from water and gum arabic. So I got the medium, dropped the color in, then I moved the surface of the Yupo. So I was painting by moving the space and surface to create the image. My hand was virtually not in it, but it wasn't sprayed. I thought, oh my God, the movement of the ink is like the Northern Lights. It's so liquid. And for a microsecond, you have 50 to 20 seconds. That material, it does all sorts of extraordinary things. I was like a Beavis and Butthead. I was just giggling to myself. I was like, ha 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 ha. I was so excited. It was like, this is chemistry meets alchemy. You know,
that's
brilliant.
Awesome. Yeah.
And so with that in mind, I started playing with those processes. And so they're another layer of experience I want to bring to the painting. My big plan is to do VR with the alcoholic paintings, but I don't know enough about that. I need to talk to a former student who's an expert in that area. We're going to work on a project together. Because I want to be able to move into the paintings themselves. That would be something,
That's awesome. That's awesome.
But see, to me, it's like if you, again, just to go into the tree, if you really look at a tree and you analyze it, it explains itself all the way through if you know what to look for. Why the bark is cracked at a certain point, why the leaves are green sometimes and red another. If you pay attention, you'll start to see the connections.
Yeah.
And so I tend to think for myself, I'm a landscape-based painter who's an abstractionist. I'm not a landscape painter, nor am I an abstract painter. I'm in between the two.
Right.
And a lot of what I'm painting, like you, is what we call the immateriality or the spiritual essence that is knowable and available to those that wish or can see it.
Yeah.
It's not a secret. It's just a level of understanding you either connect with or you don't. It's not right or wrong. It's just there for some people and not for others.
Yeah. Oh, I'm glad you brought that up. I had thought about that that subtle distinction between being an abstractionist and an abstract painter. And I was going to ask you about that because again, I can personally relate to that, and I think it's an important and subtle distinction, really, And
but it's a difficult area. But I just explained to somebody earlier in a class I was teaching this morning with my Chinese-based students. They were mostly non-Chinese, but some were Chinese American. We were talking about this notion of image and abstraction, and she was mentioning minimalism, and I said, with respect, I think you don't mean minimalism, you mean reductivism. People often will say them in the same sentence. And to me, minimalism historically is an art form which is to do with non-reference.
Yeah.
Reductivism is still referential. What I mean by abstraction is a process of essentialization or distillation. If people see moving water images, cloud forms I'm delighted. I just don't want them to tell me what they are.
Right.
Because they'll be different for different people. A cloud-like form can be light coming off reflected water, which has nothing to do with clouds, or it can be a volume of vaporous gas. But I'm interested in alluding to things, not the illusion of them. And that's where my abstraction is a form of, if you want, a kind of corruption or transformation of one thing from a known form to one that becomes somewhat familiar, but not absolutely. And that's the area I'm interested in for myself.
Right.
And I have worked completely abstractly and part of this is just as we had the moment in painting where media culture became the realm of contemplation rather than the real world. Loaded terms, but you know what I mean?
Sure.
Rauschenberg and others were using media culture, telephone, filmic images, newspapers, etc. Started with collage with Picasso and Braque.
Right.
They brought the real world into painted images. There's something about that that's very interesting. But for me, this idea of, you sit there now in front of me. I know you're a living human being X 100 miles away from me. I've seen you in person, so I know you're real for whatever that did. But I'm seeing you now, you are an image on a screen. But if I'm in the room with you, not an image, you're Thomas.
Right.
Now and I'm an image to you. So this migration of a kind of visual certainty to something which becomes describable as an image is very interesting to me. Yeah. When does the image actually occur? Is a circle an image? If it's meant to be a drawing of an apple or a sky, or the sun or the earth, then maybe yes, it's an image. But if it's not, if that's not certain, is it an image or is it simply a visual presence that we call a circle? I don't know, but I mean there aren't answers to these. But these are the things I think about when I'm making a painting. So
yeah,
the real sensational, phenomenal world. And there's a poet, Gerard Manley Hopkins, who I'm getting to understand more and more, I think. But and there's a poet in another class I teach in who knows more about this than I do, but we're touching on it, this idea of inscape. And I think you're interested in this. It's like you see a space and you resonate with it. You try to paint its essence. It's like, you think of a Rembrandt portrait. I always compare Rembrandt to, say, Frans Hals. Both of them are great painters. But what makes Rembrandt different, I think, is because he was such a deeply Christian man, by all accounts, in terms of his own, on a mystical level, like Turner. Not a churchgoer, but a believer in divine presence. And in Rembrandt's paintings, what he gives us is the human beings as incandescent. The spirit of God is within the people, the divine presence, as they exude like a psychic light bulb. Frans Hals paints reflected light of candlelight off the face, and he does it beautifully. But he's painting a physical object which has a psychological aspect. But I think Rembrandt, amongst others, is painting the spirit of humanity
Yeah.
and the divinity of the Lord in human form, you know.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. I so appreciate everything we've been talking about. We're getting to the end of our time, but you know, I wanted to ask, is there anything that you do that's not an art making that helps you to stay in your zone when you are making your artwork?
Yeah,
you know, like meditation or playing music.
I exercise for health reasons, but healthy, it's also like a sort of mesmeric thing. I do cardio and I did a lot of martial arts, but I'm too old for that. And I've got replacement hip and knee. So those days are over, but I try to keep alive by moving. But I do spend, when I can, I'm not a great hiker, but one of my great trips while I've been at the Art Institute was on a sabbatical. I went to the base camp of Everest and to Kalabatar to witness what I call a Buddhist suffused landscape, which was magnificent. But I think mostly, at least once or twice a month, I live in West Marin, so I'm very near the ocean. And I need to go and see the ocean and feel its energy and the light that comes off it. It's particularly beautiful up here, whether it's storming and gray or whether it's sunshine and beautiful. But I think for the most part, art is really a large part of my life. I have a partner, we have a life together. She's an artist too, that helps in terms of, you know, we can be in the studios and it's a good day. There's no art widows or widowers around. We're both like-minded spirits, you know. But then there's the idea, I do need to feed myself. So I read a fair amount. I don't read novels so much, poetry and probably older novels from other eras. I find them more interesting. I watch a lot of movies, listen to a lot of music. But often I'm really, all that I'm doing all the time is trying to understand essentially, and that involves interest in politics. I'm very frustrated, like most people are, with whatever side of the belief system you are. But I'm very befuddled by American politics right now and world politics and global warming. So, you know, we need to be aware of these things. And I try to maintain a positive outlook because, you know, I think lost all my family members, immediate family members to natural processes of dying. I'm very aware of mortality. And as I was saying to somebody the other day, the journey to the end is a lot shorter than the journey from the beginning. So, you know, without being maudlin, I kind of enjoy the moment whenever I can. And there's a great British writer, Raymond Briggs, a storyteller, who did a very powerful piece on anti-nuclear called When the Wind Blows, which I highly recommend. If you've got kids, if they're young, you should have them read it. It's great illustrations. But in an interview, somebody said to him, don't you consider yourself to be pessimistic? He said, no, I'm not a pessimist. He said, I just happen to think that perhaps the light at the end of the tunnel may be that of an oncoming train. And I thought that's not what I think, but I love that line, you know.
That's awesome.
But I feel for the most part, art is not so much a way of life, it's just who I am, and being an artist and teaching and helping people. Because to me, not only is it about the making, which is very important, but as much as the idea of translating and transmitting conditions of experience into communicable form other than words, you know.
Right.
And I think there's something very magical and positive about that. And I think to watch people become empowered with the capacity to say something that maybe they can't verbally. Some people are naturally able to speak through the brush or through the guitar string or whatever is the mechanism. And I think that's, you know, human creativity has been around just about as long as we've been around, period. There's signs that we've been doing this for a long time. And many things are important. Engineering, architecture, all those things are important, but something about raw creativity is concomitant with a life force, as far as I'm concerned. You know? Absolutely.
I totally agree.
I think it's a form of celebration of being alive. You know, that's something said to me. You know, we look at past civilizations for the most part very often through the lens of what art they produce. That includes architecture and buildings, but primarily the visual aesthetic or the audio aesthetic. You know, Mozart is one of, you know, countless great musicians, be they famous or otherwise, that have added to our experience of the world, you know.
Absolutely.
And I think there's a sense of connectedness we have then between the, you know, because I go back to the beginning, first art that was made, I think, without exception, was made for those that didn't inhabit the earth. It was made for the deities that probably held power over those that first acknowledged them. So the serpent mounds and Nazca lines were gifts to the heavens, not to each other. then we started to communicate with each other, you know.
Right. That's awesome. Well, this is great. I did want to mention a couple of things as we go out here. This has been a big year. This is the 150th anniversary
Indeed.
of San
Yes,
Francisco
yes.
Art Institute.
Yes.
And the pandemic is going on, and so I wanted to acknowledge that 150 year anniversary of our school, and ask, you know, in terms of the pandemic, how has that impacted your work?
I think I feel very blessed because when the school almost lost itself for reasons that are too complex to go in, there's still lots of different theories about it, but we nearly came to a stop, which has been tragic, and we still are in danger, but there's real attempts to keep the thing going, which I'm very hopeful for. But I think the fact of the matter is the pandemic in reality probably precipitated the chaos of the Art Institute. So the students who were asked to leave because at the time, presumably somebody thought that was a good idea. I don't think it was, but we can't go to be all geniuses after the fact. We damaged a lot of people. The Institute did, not we. The Institute did. And that must be acknowledged. We lost some wonderful people who had to go elsewhere to finish their schooling. And that to me was heartbreaking. And I think a lot of damage was done unwittingly. I don't think it was deliberate, but it was misguided. And I want to acknowledge that for those that may be listening. Your pain has not been disregarded by most of us that are still here. And we appreciate the fact you came in the first place, you stayed as long as you did. And, you know, you will always be part of the school for whether you want to or not. I hope you do want to be. Once you lick the wounds and you move on, I'm not going to make light of the kind of trauma many of you went through. Some managed it better than others, but you lost your home, you know, and it's been my home for over 34 years. So it's very important to me. It's an imperfect place, but it's also magical. And that's just the reality. And anywhere where human beings are involved, there's always going to be problematic at times, but also it has the capacity to be quite magnificent. And I think I just keep looking to its strengths and hope that we can never go through what we went through last year again. But mostly with the pandemic, we have to remember those that lost their lives. Luckily, I know nobody, but I know of many people, and they've obviously seen the figures, and it's desperate and sad that so many wonderful people have been taken very often needlessly because of the way things were handled. And that's a whole other story, but we must recognize that. So I feel fortunate to be here. And when I went into my studio after having gone into lockdown for a couple of weeks, I was asked by a studio mate to check on my plumbing because my bathroom has a dodgy faucet. So he wanted me to check it wasn't on. So I went to my studio, turned on the lights, and when I walked into my studio, this overwhelming sense of liberation. I thought, oh, no COVID in here. I can do what I want. This is my space. Took my mask off triumphantly, and I realized it was a sanctuary, but not a sanctuary as an escape, a sanctuary in which to really contemplate how I want to engage in the world. And with it. And that's really important.
That's awesome. Well, that's fantastic. Well, Jeremy, I think we've covered a lot of ground. And we could go for side B and go for another hour, but I think we should wrap it up here. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your participating in this interview series.
Well, I want to thank you for doing it, and I want to talk to some of my colleagues and get you connected, because I think other people should be doing this. Students,
it'd be great.
Students, and then faculty, whether they've retired or whether they're still with us. I think I can try and get some people if you like to, broaden your base. It would be.
I would love that. Yeah, okay, I would love that.
I'll talk to you about that.
Yeah,
I'll get back to you on that one-to-one, and we'll work out. I'll give you a list of people, and then I will do the contacts for you.
That would be great. That would be great. I so appreciate it. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. And, thanks you for the opportunity. Nice to share with you.
Yes, and you take care, and we'll be in touch.
We'll talk soon.
Okay. And thanks everybody. Bye for now. Thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode. Bye.
You've been listening to Speaking of Art School, an oral history project created to perpetuate the culture and legacy of the San Francisco Art Institute. I'm your host, Thomas M. Houston. If you're an alumni of SFAI and would like to participate in this project, please contact me at thomasmhoustonartist@gmail.com. Please stay tuned for upcoming episodes, and as always, thanks for listening.